this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
It's an Olympics you'll never forget. Prime time in Milan. The moments.
Chloe Kim with the gold medal flex.
The stars.
Ilya Malinin.
Out of this world.
The spectacle from beautiful northern Italy with very special guests every night of the Olympics. Experience the world's biggest show. Prime time in Milan. Tonight, 8/7 Central on NBC and Peacock.
The big game commercials are basically must-see TV. This year, Elf Cosmetics went all out with an absurdly funny telenovela called Melissa. It stars Melissa McCarthy, Nicholas Gonzalez, Itati Cantoral, and Elf Glow Reviver Lip Oil. The Elf Glow Reviver Lip Oil is an ultra-glossy tinted lip oil that nourishes, hydrates, and enhances your lips' natural color.
Watch the full episode of their new Elf novela on soyunbaño.com.
Ever wonder why so many people regain weight after stopping a GLP-1? Up to 40% of the weight lost can come from lean muscle. This weakens the body, slows metabolism, and makes it easier to put the pounds back on, creating a cycle of dependency. Prolon's 5-day fasting-mimicking diet offers a drug-free way to maintain results and support long-term metabolic health. In just 5 days, it activates fasting pathways to burn fat, protect muscle, and rejuvenate cells, all while letting you enjoy real food. Get 15% off plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe at prolonlife.com/iHeart. That's prolonlife.com/iHeart.
Over the last couple years, didn't we learn that the folding chair was invented by Black people because of what happened in Alabama?
The Montgomery Brawl.
This Black History Month, the podcast Selective Ignorance with Mandy B unpacks Black history and culture with comedy, clarity, and conversations that shake the status quo. The Crown Act in New York was signed in July of 2019, and that is a bill that was passed to prohibit discrimination based on hairstyles associated with race. To hear this and more, listen to Selective Ignorance with Mandy B from the Black Effect Podcast Network on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to the inaugural episode of One Thing Trump Did. It's available exclusively on the Middle podcast feed. I'm Jeremy Hobson, and since this is our first ever episode, I'll give you a brief synopsis. On this podcast, we're going to be looking to tackle one thing from the torrent of headlines coming out of the Trump White House. We're going to go one issue at a time, try to break things down in a rational, measured, and non-sensational, nonpartisan way, no matter how sensational the headline may be. To start things off this week, a very timely topic, we're going to be looking at Ukraine, the rapidly shifting diplomatic landscape between the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia. President Trump famously campaigned on bringing a swift end to that conflict, which is now 3 years old. But in the last several weeks, the tone from the U.S. has changed a lot, with Trump claiming falsely that Ukraine started the war and now demanding a deal that will give the U.S. hundreds of billions of dollars worth of mineral rights in exchange for supporting Ukraine. The Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, pressured Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelenskyy on Fox News Sunday over the weekend.
Zelenskyy should come to the table because this economic partnership is an important thing for the future of his country, and we hope that he will very soon.
But fair to say, Russia attacked unprovoked into Ukraine 3 years ago tomorrow.
Fair to say it's a very complicated situation.
So joining me now to parse these developments is Dan Baer, who is the director of the Europe program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's also the former U.S. ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and his book is called The Four Tests: What It Will Take to Keep America Strong and Good. Dan, great to have you on this first episode of One Thing Trump Did.
Terrific to be with you, Jeremy.
So let's start with the stakes just for our audience. Why does what happens with Ukraine matter so much to the U.S. that we have poured so much money into helping Ukraine defend itself against Russia?
Well, three quick things. First, starting with the last part, we have poured a lot of money into it, but most of that money has gone into the United States, into building kit and equipment in the United States, supporting American jobs. And that equipment has been delivered to Ukraine. And also, just to put it in context, during the entire course of this war, in 3 years now, it's been about 3% of U.S. defense spending. So just to put it in context, it is a lot of money because the United States spends a lot on defense, but it's not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things. And most of that money has been spent here at home. Why it matters? I mean, two big reasons. One, the United States does better, both economically and in a security sense, in a world in which things are more predictable. And when a big country like Russia breaks the rules and invades a neighbor, it destabilizes not only that neighbor, but also the entire world because it sets an example for others. And so those of us who are concerned about what a rising China means and what China might learn from this should also be concerned that the rules are respected and that the rules are enforced, and invading your neighbor for no reason just isn't allowed. So that's one reason. The other is economically. I mean, a lot of American jobs depend on our relationship with Europe. European security matters for America. About $500 billion a year of exports go to Europe. And those $500 billion support 2 million jobs here at home. And just to put that in context, during the first Trump administration, he had a net loss of 2.7 million jobs, and that was with the pandemic. And so to lose 2 million jobs, I mean, 2 million jobs is a lot of jobs that are dependent on our relationship with Europe and on Europe being safe and secure and prosperous.
Well, and so then I guess that's my follow-up there on Europe being safe and secure and prosperous. Is that truly at risk? If Ukraine doesn't win this war the way that they want to win the war, which would be to get all of their territorial boundaries back to the way they were before Putin even invaded Crimea, does that really put European security at risk beyond the borders of Ukraine?
I think a deal that doesn't leave Ukraine safe, secure, and independent does put European security at risk. And when we've seen borders changed by force in Europe twice in the last 110 years, it has resulted in chaos and mass destruction. And, I'm not terribly fond of the warning of World War III. I'm not sure it's terribly constructive, but certainly President Trump has done that repeatedly in recent days. And if he's really concerned about World War III, the most likely cause, if we look at World War I and World War II, is to allow, an undeterred, a situation where a dictator tries to take over other territory without consequences. That is what caused it in World War I and World War II, and we shouldn't be allowing it now.
You're talking about Vladimir Putin. Trump has started calling Volodymyr Zelenskyy a dictator. Why do you think he is doing that?
I don't know, because it's not true. And I worry as an American that President Trump is allowing his personal animus to interfere with his advocacy for American interests. Not only has he called Zelenskyy a dictator, today in the Oval Office with French President Macron, he refused to call Putin a dictator when asked by a journalist. And so the fact is, one of the two leaders is actually, by conventional definitions, a dictator. But Zelenskyy was elected with 74% of the vote several years ago. Yes, Ukraine has been under martial law because of the Russian invasion. Yes, all parties in Ukraine agree that there need to be elections as soon as possible, i.e. when a peace deal has been met and they can remove martial law. But Zelenskyy still has popular support, greater, frankly, than President Trump or President Biden had here in this country. So, I think it's not fair to call him a dictator.
Zelenskyy now says that he would actually stand down. This is in response to Trump's comments about the elections there, that he would stand down if Ukraine could join NATO. Is there any chance of that happening?
Right now, it doesn't look so, but I think it's important to recognize that even though in the last few weeks things have dramatically changed, not only in terms of the U.S. relationship with Ukraine, but also the U.S. relationship with Europe, joining NATO becomes, a lightning rod for a lot of folks. But joining NATO should be understood really as a code or a stand-in for securing Ukraine and for having, once a peace deal is struck, for having assurance that that peace deal will be respected for not only the short term, but the medium and long term. One of the ways to offer security guarantees to Ukraine would be to fast-track NATO admission, fast-track Ukraine's joining NATO, because that would provide security guarantees that would give confidence so that investors could go into Ukraine, so that Ukrainian society could start to rebuild, so that people could come back from overseas, the 5 million, I think it is, Ukrainians who are living outside of Ukraine's borders now could feel confident coming home. So joining NATO, yes, it could be on the table because President Trump and European leaders could decide to put it on the table. There's nothing that has foreclosed that option as a end for U.S. policy or European policy so far. Same thing with supporting Ukraine militarily. I mean, it feels like it's off the table, but the fact is President Trump has more power than any American president probably has had in years. And if he decided tomorrow that he wanted to go for a new supplemental to support Ukraine and make sure that President Trump could broker a good deal, he could announce that, and Congress would get behind that. They would get behind that probably with a bigger majority than Joe Biden ever saw for a supplemental for Ukraine, because he has such a good control over his party in Congress, and Democrats would get on board.
But Vladimir Putin really doesn't want Ukraine to be a part of NATO. Why is he so afraid of Ukraine joining NATO, especially given the fact that there's this mutual defense deal in NATO where if an attack on one is an attack on all. But if you look at what just happened, all of these other NATO countries did come to Ukraine's aid anyway. So why is Putin so afraid of Ukraine actually officially being a part of NATO?
I think for him and some in the Russian establishment too, it has become more a symbol than a reality. I mean, I am probably not everybody in Washington would agree with me, but I happen to think that NATO has been on the whole good for Russia. It has been something that has kept Russia's neighbors to the West safe and secure. It has probably been the thing that has prevented, say, Poland from seeking nuclear weapons, because Poland has felt safe and secure in NATO. And so it has actually given Russia more stable borders that have allowed it to deal with other kinds of security threats. There is, I believe, zero threat that comes. NATO is a defensive alliance. There is no threat to Russia that comes from Ukraine or any other country being part of NATO. The only threat to Russia is that if Vladimir Putin intends to continue to adventure beyond his borders and invade countries, it does make it harder for him to do that. So the only thing that it forecloses in terms of options for him are further violations of international law or further destabilizing of the regional security situation.
Do you think, Dan Baer, that NATO's existence in general is at stake in all of what is happening right now with Ukraine?
I don't think its existence in general is at stake, but I think it has already changed significantly. The United States military capacity is the backbone of NATO. It is part of what makes the NATO deterrent, the commitment that NATO members have to defend each other, a credible deterrent. And by the way, it's important to remind folks that the only time that it's ever been invoked, the only time that a NATO member has ever said, we call on everyone else to join with us and come to our defense, is in the wake of September 11th. Exactly. Right. But that credible deterrent depends on the United States being committed. And I believe that military leaders, congressional leaders, many Trump officials remain committed to NATO as an alliance, as being part of the cornerstone of the U.S. approach to global security. But I certainly think that there are questions that have been raised in recent weeks that probably make it less strong than it was a month ago.
You know, just for our listeners, a little interesting tidbit. One of the countries that always did meet its 2% GDP spending on defense, even before Trump got angry about this, was Greece, because Greece is worried about Turkey. It really has nothing to do with anything else besides
and also
that.
Because Greece has a huge navy and navies
right. That's right. That's right. What's going on now with the negotiations? Because there's reporting that, Trump is trying to go around Ukraine, and there were meetings just between the U.S. and Russia and Saudi Arabia. What's happening with the negotiations at the moment?
It's hard to say. Obviously, it's not only Ukraine, but also our European allies who have been cut out of the Trump conversation so far. There are worrying reports of President Trump's conversations with President Putin, and it does feel like some days it feels like instead of solving the war in a day, as he promised to on the campaign trail, he actually has come close to losing the war in a day. But I don't think it is too late to salvage a good deal. I do think in the long run, Ukraine needs to be at the table. They don't have to be at the table in every meeting. The fact that they weren't in this first meeting may be deemed unfortunate, but it's not irreparable. But Ukraine needs to be at the table because whatever deal is made needs to be one that can be sold at home in Ukraine as a decent deal that allows Ukraine the kind of future that the Ukrainian people want. And, there's wide parameters for what that might look like, but Ukraine does need to be at the table. And so do the Europeans, because we are going to, as President Trump has said, we are going to count on the Europeans to step up and to do more to secure their own region. And if they're going to have to step up and do more, then they're going to need to know what the terms of the deal are that they're going to have to step up and do support.
Dan, we talked a little bit about Trump's idea that
this podcast is supported by the original organic bedding and bath brand, Koyuchi.
Koyuchi has spent 35 years pioneering quality organic textiles, long before the word organic became, trendy. But words matter to Koyuchi. Words like craftsmanship, longevity, and wellness. So what does the word wellness mean to Koyuchi? It means that all of our products are absolutely free from harsh chemicals and dangerous toxins that can seep into your skin. It means effortless style that looks as good as it feels with naturally breathable, pre-washed organic cotton. And what does all of that mean to you? Well, it means that you can sleep well in Koyuchi's crisp, cool, luxuriously soft sheets that are ethically made and made with you in mind. Live well, sleep well with Koyuchi. And now during our Memorial Day sale event, you can enjoy 20% off organic cotton sheets, towels, and everything else at Koyuchi.com. That's Koyuchi.com for 20% off from now until May 25th. Koyuchi.com.
The U.S. should get paid back, that there should be some deal involving money from Ukraine's rare earth minerals. A Democratic lawmaker was on one of the Sunday talk shows over the weekend and said that reminded him out of something out of The Sopranos, that it was like what the mafia does. What do you think that does, sort of demanding something from a democracy that we're trying to defend? What does that do to America's image around the world if the U.S. is doing this not out of the goodness of its heart or not because it's in its interests to help a fellow democracy, but because we want money?
Yeah, I mean, there is a nice little country you've got there. It would be a shame if something happened to it. Subtext all this. I've been trying to stay focused and not get distracted by the minerals deal. I mean, some of the numbers that are being thrown around there don't feel realistic in the near term to me in any case. I think there are, so I see that more as, at this point, an opportunity for President Trump to politically sell something at home. And I think it is an opportunity, frankly, for him to do more to support Ukraine in the short term, because he can say we have an investment there and we need to protect that investment, et cetera. So maybe it turns out to be useful politically for him at home. I do think one of the concerns, I would be less focused on the numbers and more focused on who ends up getting these financial interests. Are they private American entities or is it public entities? Because there's also a hint of King Leopold and the Congo here, where things feel like a kind of a privatized form of economic neocolonialism, and that would make me anxious just from a corruption standpoint.
We're talking with Dan Baer, who is the director of the Europe program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, on this episode of One Thing Trump Did. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
It's an Olympics you'll never forget. Prime time in Milan. The moments.
Chloe Kim with the gold medal flex.
The stars.
Ilya Malinin.
Out of this world.
The spectacle from beautiful northern Italy with very special guests every night of the Olympics. Experience the world's biggest show. Prime time in Milan. Tonight, 8/7 Central on NBC and Peacock.
Welcome to the A Building. I'm Hans Charles.
I'm Menelik Lumumba. It's 1969. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. had both been assassinated, and Black America was at a breaking point. Rioting and protests broke out on an unprecedented scale.
In Atlanta, Georgia, at Martin's alma mater, Morehouse College, the students had their own protest. It featured two prominent figures in Black history. Martin Luther King Sr., and a young student, Samuel L. Jackson.
To be in what we really thought was a revolution. I mean, people were dying.
1968, the murder of Dr. King, which traumatized everyone.
The FBI had a role in the murder of a Black Panther leader in Chicago.
This story is about protest. It echoes in today's world far more than it should, and it will blow your mind.
Listen to The A Building on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Ryder Strong, and I have a new podcast called The Red Weather.
It was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea.
In 1995, my neighbor, Anna Trainer, disappeared from a commune.
It was hard to wrap your head around. It was nature and trees and praying and drugs.
So no, I am not your guru.
And back then, I lied to my parents, I lied to police, I lied to everybody.
There were years, Ryder, where I could not say your name.
I've decided to go back to my hometown in Northern California, interview my friends, family, talk to police, journalists, whomever I can, to try to find out what actually happened.
Isn't it a little bit weird that they obsess over hippies in the woods and not the obvious boyfriend?
They have had this case for 30 years.
I'll teach you sons of to come around here and my wife.
Boom, boom. This is The Red Weather. Listen to The Red Weather on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
I actually drive better when I'm high. It heightens my senses, calms me down. If anything, I'm more careful. Honestly, it just helps me focus.
That's probably what the driver who killed a 4-year-old told himself. And now he's in prison. You see, no matter what you tell yourself, if you feel different, you drive different. So if you're high, just don't drive. Brought to you by NHTSA and the Ad Council.
Welcome back to One Thing Trump Did, exclusively on the Middle podcast feed. I'm Jeremy Hobson. We're talking about Ukraine, a lot at stake right now. I'm joined by Dan Baer, director of the Europe program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as well as former U.S. ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Dan, you mentioned this, but one of the things that comes up in terms of the stakes of this situation in Ukraine for the United States is China and Taiwan, and whether China is looking at this and saying, well, if Putin's going to get away with this and is going to get some of the territory, if not all the territory he's after in Ukraine after all of this many years of war and pushback from the West, if he gets it, President Xi is just going to say, okay, well, then that means I can take Taiwan and there's going to be no problem. There's going to be no pushback there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's quite as simple as that. And frankly, the interests with respect to China's rise, obviously Taiwan is one that gets a lot of visibility in Washington and in Europe. But there are other interests about China's encroachment in the South China Sea that affect Southeast Asian neighbors, et cetera. And I think certainly there are, you have to expect that when a large country is allowed to bully a smaller country without consequences. And frankly, when the United States, which is the most powerful country on earth still, not relatively as powerful as we were 30 years ago, but still the most powerful country on earth, decides to throw all in with the bully rather than the victim, that does make folks in other capitals wonder whether there will be consequences for breaking the rules in the future, and that applies to a whole range of situations. Obviously, the situation with Taiwan is very complex and not entirely analogous to, in many ways, to the situation in Eastern Europe, but certainly China is watching carefully how the United States responds and learning about President Trump's priorities and his proclivities.
We just did an entire show with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation about Trump's continued suggestion that the U.S. should take over Canada as the 51st state. And in that program, which was broadcast live across the U.S. and Canada, we also mentioned, of course, that Trump has talked about taking Greenland, Gaza, and the Panama Canal.
Yeah, I mean, here it's one of the things By the way, I've been annoyed at that for petty parochial reasons because I had told the editor of Foreign Affairs last year that I wanted to write a piece about how the geopolitical play of the 21st century would be a voluntary confederation of the U.S. and Canada, because together we would have more natural resources, Canada would be more easily defended, et cetera. So the idea itself is not terribly preposterous to me. Of course, I would envision it by democratic means, not by a kind of colonial or militaristic takeover. But I mean, with all of these things, on the one hand, you can just see them as what he does so well. President Trump is very good at controlling the narrative, at shifting the narrative. And if he reads the political moment and says a lot of Americans feel like they're on defense, defense against global threats, defense against chaos, defense against social media, whatever, then talking about taking over places is a way to kind of shift the narrative and make people feel like, hey, we're on offense again. Our team's on offense again. And that alone can deliver political dividends. And so on the one hand, you could look at it that way, or you could look at it as a genuine kind of 19th century, he's enamored with President Putin. President Putin likes to expand Russia's share of the map, and that's what he's trying to do in a neo-colonial fashion, rebuild the Russian empire. And President Trump decides he wants to build an American empire. Or you could look at the deal that he's trying to broker in Ukraine with the critical minerals and the joint investment stuff, and you could look at what he said about Greenland and say, actually, at heart, he's still just a real estate deal maker, and these are real estate deals to him, and he's thinking about it in those terms, with a kind of businessman's deal making behind it, and possibly for the gain of not necessarily only public coffers.
Let's talk about Europe, because the war in Ukraine has certainly caused upheaval in European politics. We've seen the right politically rising in Italy, in France, although not enough to win in the country, but in Germany just now with the elections, the conservatives won there, and the far right actually did very well as well. What do the Europeans want to happen in Ukraine, or is it split right now, or is it splitting in Europe about what people actually would like to occur?
I think that, obviously there are many countries that make up, quote unquote, the Europeans, and within each country there are, as in our own, there are people who lie across a spectrum of political views. But I think in general, actually, the last few weeks, even if they generated some chaos and panic in the first instance, I think they've actually been consolidating for European views. Today, you saw, for instance, the leaders of Spain and some of the Baltic countries together in Kyiv to commemorate the third anniversary of the war. And Spain hasn't conventionally been thought of as being kind of on the front end of the we got to defend Ukraine at all costs train. The Baltics much more so. So you're seeing some solidarity across the European continent. Certainly, I think that the rise of the far right has less to do with the Russia's war against Ukraine and more to do with the fact that Europe has failed to get back to economic growth in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. So one of the priorities for European leaders is going to be getting enough security, making sure that Ukraine is secure enough that Europe itself can get back to growth in the decade to come, because they really can't afford to have another lost decade.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just going back to our trip just now to Canada for this special that we did, and I was speaking with Canadians, and one of them was telling me that their economy is shit, and I'm allowed to say shit on this podcast. I can't do that on the radio version of the middle, but I can say their economy is shit right now. That the Canadian dollar is way down compared to other currencies. It's so much more expensive, and it reminds me as an American where we've actually, in the last few years since the pandemic, had an economy that has really outperformed so many other places. You think about European countries, their economies are not as good right now comparatively, and they're dealing with a huge influx of migrants coming in from the Middle East and countries that are in the middle of war, and Ukraine, of course. So dealing with a lot of things that we don't really think about as much here in the U.S.
It's absolutely right. And you hear the talking point on the left and right in this country that, Europe is a rich place that can afford to do more. And certainly they can afford to do more. And Europe is a rich continent when compared to almost all other continents. But when compared to the United States, I think a lot of people would be surprised to see what GDP per capita in the UK is compared to the United States, what GDP per capita in France is, or in Germany, places that are considered the rich parts of Europe. The United States has grown since the 2008 financial crisis, and Europeans have not kept up. And if you look at the graph of GDP per capita for the United States compared to major European countries or the EU as a whole, it tells a very difficult story for Europe. And by the way, one of the things that Americans should understand is that that is a problem for us too, not only because we count on Europe as a market to export to, but because as we look forward to the coming decades and the challenges of artificial intelligence, of new pandemics, of all these problems without passports, we're going to need the Europeans to help us solve them. We are not going to be able to solve them alone. Of further geopolitical conflict, we want to have a strong Europe as partners. They are our most reliable democratic partners, advanced democracies in the world, and we need them to be strong. And so we want them to grow too.
Let's talk about President Biden, former President Biden's handling of the war in Ukraine. Trump has been attacking it. Is saying that it never would have started if he were in office, or if it did start, it would have finished very quickly. With the caveat that you worked in the Obama administration, do you fault Biden at all for allowing the war to start, or do you have criticism of his handling of the war in Ukraine?
For allowing the war to start, absolutely not. The responsibility for starting the war lies in Moscow, and in Moscow only. There was nothing that Ukraine did to provoke this war, and in fact, the United States, in a relatively novel way, saw the war coming, saw the Russian war preparations, and made President Biden and his national security team made a very innovative decision to declassify a lot of intelligence in the weeks and months leading up to the Russian invasion in an attempt both to tell the Russians, look, we see what you're doing and we're going to be prepared to respond with consequences, and also to get Europeans and others to take seriously this threat. I think there was a real effort diplomatically and with novel use of intelligence to try to forestall the invasion. In terms of the conduct of American support for Ukraine since the war started, it is easy for people on the outside like me to Monday morning quarterback every single decision. But I think there was overall within the Biden administration a commitment to get Ukraine the equipment and supplies that it needed to fight back, and to do so in a way that was attentive to risks of escalation. Do I personally think that at times they were too attentive to risks of escalation? Sure, I do. And it's easy for me to say that. I didn't have the responsibility of making sure that things didn't escalate. I would point out that from the perspective of the United States, our support for Ukraine, as I said, has amounted to about 3% of military spending, and it has absolutely had critical damage, not fully destroyed, but critical damage on the military efficacy of one of the greatest potential adversaries, the Russian Federation. The Russian military has been deeply damaged by this war. It will take them years to recover. So from the standpoint of the United States, for a low cost, because Ukrainians have been doing the fighting, not a single American life has been lost. For a low cost, we have severely hampered the capabilities of a major potential adversary.
You think Russia is significantly weaker now than it was a few years ago when the war started?
Absolutely. They have lost hundreds of thousands in casualties. They've had a lot of their equipment destroyed. They are working through,
or we've just seen some of their equipment, which is like from decades ago. And
right, I was going to say they're working through their stores, and my colleagues who are analysts of the Russian military forces suggest that they probably have another 18 months or so of stuff in storage that they can pull out and try to fix up and use for spare parts, one machine for another. But they are also struggling to keep up with the pace of this war. And so Russia is actually not able to sustain this forever, even though Putin has a wartime economy. They're not able to sustain it forever. And they certainly are less capable in terms of a fight. If they were to take on, say, the United States, they would be less capable as an adversary than they would have been 2 or 3 years ago.
And when you look outside of the war in Ukraine, Russia also just lost this kind of war that it was really playing a role in Syria to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. He's had to pull in North Korean troops to fight in Ukraine with the Russians. it does seem like it's strange that Putin looks to be in such a position of power with the negotiations right now, given how weak you say and how weak we see that he's become because of the war.
Yeah, I mean, President Trump prides himself on being a terrific negotiator, and it may be that you and I don't have full information right now, but the last few weeks look like the United States has played a strong hand poorly, and Vladimir Putin has played a relatively weaker hand quite well. It doesn't look like he has lost anything. President Trump has given President Putin a lot of things that he wanted without actually having to negotiate for them. I will also point out, you mentioned the Russian involvement in Syria. People who say Putin can't pull out of Ukraine or can't have a peace in Ukraine that would be fair to Ukraine because he can't sell it at home. They got completely routed in Syria. And the line that President Putin used was, we accomplished all of our objectives. It was a victory for Russian interest, and we're done there. So he can sell whatever he wants at home. The fact is, we need to have real negotiations that get a fair deal for Ukraine that can be secure enough to have a real peace that people can have confidence in, so that it can have elections and so that the Ukrainian people can get back to building the democratic future that they want.
So, Dan Baer, what is your prediction about what will happen now with Ukraine over the next several weeks? It seems like it's on the front burner in the foreign policy agenda of the Trump administration right now.
Yeah, it feels like it is on the front burner of the foreign policy. I mean, one of the things that President Trump does well, and that the people around him seem to have taken up from him, is that he makes himself very unpredictable. So I'm loath to hazard a guess.
Right.
I will say that I think the departure from facts, calling Zelenskyy a dictator when he's not saying that Putin didn't start the war when he did, all of that stuff makes me quite nervous. But there's still, I reassure myself by saying President Trump actually still has a good hand to play. If he wanted to make a deal where the Europeans had to make a long-term commitment to buy more American equipment, to spend more themselves on developing their defense industrial base, taking on the responsibility for helping fund Ukraine's reconstruction, and in exchange, the U.S. agreed not to pull out precipitously and to continue to provide weapons in the short to medium term, and to help bring the Europeans, Ukrainians, and Russians together to make a deal that could have a peace agreement and to secure Ukraine's future, that's all within his power. He could actually make a good deal and sell it at home and say, look, I've got a peace agreement. Ukraine's going to be secure. The Europeans are going to do more. America's going to have to do less. And we have peace in Europe. And that's a win for him. And that is still available to him if he makes the right decisions going forward.
That is Dan Baer, who is the director of the Europe program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's also former U.S. ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and his new book is called The Four Tests: What It Will Take to Keep America Strong and Good. Dan, so great to talk to you as always. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to you for listening to our first episode of One Thing Trump Did. It was produced by Harrison Patino. Our next middle episode will be in your podcast feed later this week. It's our conversation with astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson about space exploration, life on other planets, and more. And if you like this podcast, please rate it wherever you get your podcast. Tell your friends. And by the way, we are only about $2,000 away from our donation goal. All donations are matched dollar for dollar right now. You can make a contribution at listentothemiddle.com. Our theme music here was composed by Noah Haidu. I'm Jeremy Hobson. Talk to you soon.
Over the last couple years, didn't we learn that the folding chair was invented by Black people because of what happened in Alabama?
The Montgomery Brawl.
This Black History Month, the podcast Selective Ignorance with Mandy B unpacks Black history and culture with comedy, clarity, and conversations that shake the status quo. The Crown Act in New York was signed in July of 2019, and that is a bill that was passed to prohibit discrimination based on hairstyles associated with race. To hear this and more, listen to Selective Ignorance with Mandy B from the Black Effect Podcast Network on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
1969, Malcolm and Martin are gone. America is in crisis. And at Morehouse College, the students make their move.
These students, including a young Samuel L. Jackson, locked up the members of the Board of Trustees, including Martin Luther King Sr. It's the true story of protest and rebellion in Black American history that you'll never forget. I'm Hans Charles.
I'm Menelik Lumumba.
Listen to The A Building on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
14 years in prison for killing a young woman. A 15-year sentence for a crash that caused 3 deaths. 12 and a half years for killing a child and critically injuring her mother. All true stories, all caused by marijuana-impaired drivers. No matter what you tell yourself, if you feel different, you drive different. So, if you're high, just don't drive. Brought to you by NHTSA and the Ad Council.
This is Ryder Strong, and I have a new podcast called The Red Weather. In 1995, my neighbor, Anna Trainer, disappeared from a commune.
It was nature and trees and praying and drugs.
So no, I am not your guru.
And back then, I lied to everybody.
They have had this case for 30 years.
I'm going back to my hometown to uncover the truth. Listen to The Red Weather on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.